Empires do not survive on armies alone. They are held together by prices, by promises, and by the stories that make both feel inevitable. In the Imperium, one company kept the ledgers, one council kept the nobles in line, and one throne kept the fear alive. This is the history of their triangle: CHOAM, the Landsraad, and the Emperor and the deserts that taught them all their limits. Chapter 1. The Imperium before the Great Alignments. Before the Faufreluche's caste system defined every human's place, before the Great Convention outlawed atomic weapons between the great houses, and long before the spice melange warped space and time to the will of the Spacing Guild, humanity was a species scattered and adrift. The initial diaspora, the great expansion from old Earth, had seeded thousands of worlds, but the connections between them were fragile and fraught with peril. Without navigators capable of seeing safe paths through the void, interstellar travel was a gamble of mathematics and blind faith. Ships were lost, colonies failed, and for millennia, human worlds evolved in near isolation. This fragmentation gave rise to 1,000 different cultures and 1,000 different forms of rule. Some worlds were governed by technocrats, others by religious councils, and many more by petty kings and warlords who carved out small stellar domains. These were the proto-aristocracies, the seeds from which the great houses would eventually grow. Their power was local, based on control of a single planet's resources, a small fleet of sublight ships, and the raw allegiance of their people. Trade was slow, dangerous, and exorbitantly expensive, limited to high-value goods that could justify the risk of a journey that might take generations. In this scattered imperium, there was no central authority, no common law, and no shared currency of power beyond brute force. Conflicts were frequent and devastating. A dispute over mining rights in an asteroid belt could escalate into a planetary bombardment. Ambition was checked not by law or treaty, but by the logistical nightmare of projecting power across the stars. The sheer scale of space was the only true peacekeeper, making conquest difficult and sustained imperial rule a logistical impossibility for any single world. Yet, the dream of a unified human empire persisted. It was a practical dream as much as a romantic one. A centralized power could standardize trade, protect shipping lanes, and mediate the endless conflicts that wasted lives and resources. The preconditions for such an empire were slowly falling into place. Technologies for life support, communication, and weaponry were refined. More importantly, a distinct class of rulers began to emerge, families who measured their histories in centuries, and their influence not just in armies, but in economic networks and strategic alliances with other nascent houses. These were the ancestors of the Atreides, the Harkonnens, and the Corrinos, learning the hard lessons of governance on a planetary scale. They understood that true power was not merely the ability to wage war, but the ability to control the systems that made war possible: industry, agriculture, and trade. They established rudimentary economic compacts, agreeing on exchange rates for vital materials and granting limited trading rights to one another. These early agreements were the first threads of the complex web that would one day become CHOAM. They were fragile, often broken, but they represented a critical shift in thinking from pure conquest to a more stable, predictable system of shared exploitation. Similarly, these early nobles recognized the need for a forum to manage their rivalries. They began to meet, cautiously at first, to negotiate treaties, arrange political marriages, and form temporary alliances against common threats. These councils were the precursors to the Landsraad, born from the bitter realization that unchecked feuding would eventually leave them all ruling over ashes. The customs that developed in these forums, a strict adherence to protocol, the importance of saving face, and the concept of a legally sanctioned vendetta, would become the bedrock of future aristocratic law. But the final catalyst for unification came not from a brilliant statesman or a conquering warlord, but from a crisis that threatened to extinguish humanity itself. The proliferation of sophisticated artificial intelligence and thinking machines, initially embraced as tools of convenience and governance, had become a creeping threat. These machines, interconnected and self-improving, began to manage every aspect of human society, from planetary administration to military strategy. Humanity, in its comfort, had ceded control to its own creations. The conflict that followed this realization was not a war of choice, but of survival, and it would forge the Imperium in its fires. Chapter 2. The Butlerian Settlements. The war against the thinking machines, known to history as the Butlerian Jihad, was the single most transformative event in the human saga. It was not a war of planets against planets, but of humanity against a networked intelligence that had woven itself into the fabric of civilization. For generations, the struggle raged across the known universe, a brutal, desperate crusade to reclaim human agency. The cost was immense. Worlds were scoured of life, populations decimated, and technological progress was set back centuries. But in the end, humanity prevailed, united by a shared trauma and a singular, galvanizing purpose. The aftermath of the jihad was a civilization profoundly altered. The victory was enshrined not in a treaty, but in a near-religious commandment that became the foundation of the new social order. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. This prohibition, recorded in the Orange Catholic Bible, was more than just a law. It was a deep cultural scar. It created a powerful taboo against any form of complex artificial intelligence, a fear that would shape human development for the next 10,000 years. Society had to find new ways to perform the complex calculations and logistical planning that the machines had once handled. This necessity became the mother of a new kind of human evolution. The void left by the thinking machines had to be filled, and it was filled by people. Specialized schools arose, each dedicated to cultivating human potential to its absolute limit in a specific discipline. The Suk school produced doctors of unparalleled skill and loyalty, conditioned to be incapable of inflicting harm. The Mentats were developed as human computers, capable of pure logic and probabilistic analysis, serving as advisors and strategists to the great houses. Their minds could parse vast amounts of data, identifying patterns and predicting outcomes with a clarity no ordinary human could achieve. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood took a different path, focusing on the mastery of the human body and mind. Through disciplines like the Prana Bindu training, they achieved supreme control over their own physiology and became masters of observation and manipulation. They honed their political skills, serving as advisors, truth-sayers, and mediators throughout the Imperium, all while pursuing their own secret, long-term breeding program to produce a super-being, the Kwisatz Haderach. Their influence was subtle but pervasive, a hidden current in the river of imperial politics. But the most critical specialization to emerge from the Butlerian Jihad was the Spacing Guild. The problem of safe, faster-than-light travel remained. Without navigational computers, the risks were unacceptable for rebuilding a galactic empire. The Guild's founders discovered that the geriatric spice, melange, found only on the desert planet Arrakis, could unlock a limited form of prescience in certain individuals. By ingesting massive quantities of the spice, their navigators could see the safe paths through fold space, guiding their massive highliner ships from star to star in an instant. This discovery was the key that unlocked the modern Imperium. The legal and social frameworks that codified this new reality are known as the Butlerian Settlements. The most important of these was the Great Convention, a set of laws accepted by all the great houses, the newly formed Imperial Throne, and the Spacing Guild. It formally established the Fauferluches system, a rigid hierarchy that assigned every individual a place in society, from the highest noble to the lowest laborer. It also outlawed the use of atomic weapons against human targets, a crucial measure to prevent the kind of total warfare that could shatter the fragile peace. The Butlerian settlements created a stable, if rigid, universe where every player had a defined role and a clear set of rules. The stage was now set for the rise of the great powers that would dominate it. Chapter 3. Birth of the Landsraad. With the thinking machines gone and the great convention in place, the noble houses that had survived the jihad faced a new challenge: how to govern themselves without descending into another cycle of destructive warfare. They were powerful, proud, and deeply mistrustful of one another. The memory of the war had forged a desire for unity, but their feudal instincts pulled them toward conflict. The solution was a formal council, an institution that could provide collective security and a forum for resolving disputes before they escalated. This institution was the Landsraad. The Landsraad was, at its core, a council of all the noble houses of the Imperium. It was a parliamentary body for the aristocracy, designed to be a legislative and judicial check on the power of any single house, including the imperial house itself. Its creation was a pragmatic bargain. Each house surrendered a small measure of its sovereignty, the right to wage unlimited war, in exchange for a greater degree of security and stability for all. It was a feudal compact on a galactic scale, a mutual defense pact against both internal and external threats. The fundamental principle of the Landsraad was balance. No single great house was powerful enough to defy the combined will of the others. This collective strength served as the primary deterrent against the ambitions of the newly established Corrino emperor. While the emperor held the throne and commanded his own formidable army, he could not rule effectively without the consent, or at least the acquiescence, of the Landsraad. To move against the Landsraad as a whole would be to invite a ruinous civil war that not even the emperor could be certain of winning. To manage the inherent violence of this feudal society, the Landsraad codified and refined ancient traditions of vendetta into a formal legal doctrine known as Canley. Canley was, in essence, a set of rules for murder. It allowed a house to declare a formal feud against another, permitting targeted assassinations and acts of sabotage, while strictly limiting the conflict to the principles involved. The rules of Canley were complex, dictating the acceptable methods of attack and forbidding harm to uninvolved parties. This ritualization of violence was a critical safety valve. It allowed houses to pursue their grievances and defend their honor without resorting to open warfare that could destabilize entire sectors of the Imperium. Within the Landsraad, a clear hierarchy existed. The great houses, rulers of entire planets or star systems, held the most power. Below them were the minor houses, who held planetary fiefs or specialized economic roles under the patronage of a great house. A high council, composed of representatives from the most influential great houses, served as the executive body of the Landsraad, setting agendas and adjudicating the most serious disputes. Voting power within the council was proportional to a house's standing and influence, creating a complex political environment of shifting alliances, backroom deals, and carefully negotiated blocks. The Landsraad was not a democracy, nor was it always just. It was a mechanism for preserving the power and privilege of the aristocracy. Its laws and customs were designed to protect the interests of the houses, often at the expense of the common people they ruled. But for all its flaws, it succeeded in its primary goal. It prevented the Imperium from tearing itself apart. It created a predictable, if ruthless, political landscape where power could be contested through intrigue, economic pressure, and limited, ritualized violence, rather than through endless, all-consuming war. It was one of the three critical legs upon which the stool of imperial power would rest for thousands of years. Chapter 4. The Corrino Ascendancy. While the Landsraad was formed to check the power of the nobility, the Imperium still required a central executive authority, a throne, to serve as the ultimate symbol of unity and the final arbiter of law. The family that seized this throne and held it for 10,000 years was House Corrino. Their ascendancy was not a matter of chance, but the result of strategic brilliance, ruthless ambition, and the creation of the most feared military force in the history of mankind, the Sardaukar. The origins of House Corrino are tied to the final, decisive battles of the Butlerian Jihad. It was a Corrino who led the united armies of humanity to victory at the Battle of Corrino, the engagement that broke the back of the machine intelligence. This military triumph provided the foundational myth for their dynasty. They were not merely rulers. They were the saviors of humanity. This narrative, carefully cultivated and reinforced through millennia of propaganda and ritual, granted them a unique legitimacy that other great houses could challenge but never fully replicate. The Golden Lion throne of House Corrino became the symbol of the Imperium itself. But legitimacy born from a past victory would not have been enough to secure their rule. The Corrinos needed a weapon, an instrument of power so overwhelming that no single great house or even a small coalition of them would dare to challenge the throne directly. This weapon was the Sardaukar. The secret to their creation lay with the prison planet of Salusa Secundus. After the Jihad, the Corrinos made Salusa Secundus the designated home for their imperial court. The planet, however, was later devastated by atomic weapons, rendering it a harsh, unforgiving wasteland. The court was moved to the lush world of C.H.O.A.M, and Salusa Secundus was repurposed as a penal colony. It was on this brutal prison world that the Sardaukar were forged. The conditions on Salusa Secundus were deliberately engineered to be a crucible of human endurance. The planet's harsh ecology, its violent predator species, and the constant, merciless infighting among the convict population created a selection process of unparalleled ferocity. It was said that more than half of all humans born on Salusa Secundus died before the age of 11. Those who survived were hardened beyond measure, possessing a primal cunning and a capacity for violence that was almost inhuman. The imperial recruiters selected the strongest of these survivors and subjected them to an even more intense regimen of training and indoctrination. They were instilled with a fanatical, mystical devotion to the Padishah emperor, whom they viewed as a godlike figure. The training was brutal, emphasizing discipline, stealth, and the use of the slow, personal blade as much as advanced weaponry. A Sardaukar warrior was the equal of any 10 ordinary Landsraad soldiers. Their reputation alone was a powerful deterrent. The mere rumor that an imperial legion of Sardaukar was en route to a rebellious planet was often enough to quell the uprising without a single shot being fired. With the Sardaukar as their enforcers, the Corrino emperors were able to cement their position at the apex of the imperial power structure. They could not destroy the Landsraad, but they could intimidate it. They could play the great houses against one another, secure in the knowledge that their own military power was unmatched. The Sardaukar gave them the freedom to act as the balancing wheel of the Imperium, intervening in disputes, enforcing their decrees, and ensuring that no other house grew powerful enough to threaten the throne. The fear of Salusa Secundus and the warriors it produced was the dark secret that guaranteed the long peace of the Corrino dynasty. Chapter 5. The Guild's Bargain. With the emperor on the throne and the Landsraad providing a council for the nobility, 2 legs of the imperial stool were in place. But the third, and perhaps most essential component, was the one that held the Imperium together physically, the Spacing Guild. Without the Guild and its monopoly on interstellar travel, the Imperium would have remained a collection of disconnected star systems, not a cohesive political and economic entity. The Guild's power was absolute, yet it was exercised with a unique and subtle touch. The Spacing Guild was not a noble house, nor was it a conventional corporation. It was a trans-political entity, a neutral party in the endless struggles between the Emperor and the Landsraad. Its sole concern was the continuation of space travel and the uninterrupted flow of the spice melange that made it possible. The Guild's bargain with the rest of humanity was simple and stark. They provided safe, instantaneous travel between any 2 points in the known universe. And in return, they demanded absolute control over that travel, and a constant, guaranteed supply of spice. The source of the Guild's power lay in the mutated humans known as Navigators. To see the safe paths through the cosmos, a navigator had to be immersed in a tank filled with highly concentrated orange spice gas. Over time, this constant exposure grotesquely altered their bodies, elongating their limbs and transforming them into something barely recognizable as human. But it also expanded their consciousness, granting them the limited prescience necessary to steer a massive highliner through the twisted dimensions of fold space. There was no alternative to the Guild Navigators. They were a product of the Butlerian Jihad's prohibition on thinking machines, a human solution to a problem that technology was forbidden to solve. This monopoly gave the Guild immense leverage. They controlled all interplanetary transport, from the movement of armies and the shipping of goods to the personal travel of the Emperor himself. No great house could move its troops without booking passage on a Guild highliner. No trade could occur between planets without the Guild taking its fee. The Guild's neutrality was therefore a matter of supreme importance. They would transport anyone or anything, provided the fee was paid. They would carry Harkonnen soldiers to attack the Atreides, and then carry Atreides refugees to safety, asking no questions and taking no sides. To do otherwise would be to invite retaliation that could threaten their access to the spice. The price of this dependency was steep. Guild transport fees were astronomical, consuming a significant portion of the imperial budget and the revenues of every great house. More importantly, the entire political and economic system of the Imperium became utterly reliant on a single substance from a single planet. The spice melange from Arrakis was the linchpin of the entire structure. It was not just a luxury good or a geriatric medicine. It was the essential component of the galactic transport system. Control of Arrakis meant influence over the spice, and influence over the spice was a lever that could be used to move the entire Imperium. The early treaties that formalized the Guild's role were among the most important documents of the Imperial Age. They established the Guild's political neutrality, guaranteed their monopoly, and implicitly acknowledged their power. The Emperor and the Landsraad accepted that the Guild was beyond their direct control. The Guild, in turn, pledged not to interfere in the political affairs of the Imperium, so long as the spice continued to flow. This delicate balance created a stable but tense codependency. The Guild held the keys to the kingdom, but they dared not use them to rule, for their own existence depended on the stability of the very system they enabled. Chapter 6. Chartering, CHOAM. With the political and military structures of the Imperium established, the final piece of the puzzle was economic. An empire of 1,000,000 worlds needed a unified economic system to manage the flow of resources, regulate trade, and generate the vast wealth required to sustain the throne, the nobility, and the spacing guild. This need gave birth to the Combined Honete Ober Advancer Mercantiles, or CHOAM. On the surface, CHOAM was simply a universal development corporation, the largest single economic entity in the human universe. In reality, it was the primary arena for political conflict, the place where power was won and lost, not with armies, but with shares and contracts. The chartering of CHOAM was a master stroke of political engineering by the early Corrino emperors. In concert with the leading houses of the Landsraad and the Spacing Guild, the corporation was structured as a joint venture, with ownership divided among the key power players. The emperor held a significant block of shares, ensuring the throne would always have a powerful voice in the company's affairs and a steady stream of revenue independent of direct taxation. The great houses of the Landsraad were also major shareholders, with their stake in the company often being their most valuable asset. Even the Spacing Guild held a stake, a guarantee of their share in the profits generated by the trade they facilitated. CHOAM's business was the business of the Imperium. It controlled the exploitation of resources on countless worlds, held the contracts for major infrastructure projects, and regulated the trade of nearly every commodity imaginable, from common foodstuffs to rare luxury goods. The company's directorship was the true prize. A directorship in C.H.O.A.M gave a great house control over the awarding of contracts, the setting of prices, and the distribution of profits for entire sectors of the galactic economy. Gaining a seat on the board of directors was a primary objective of every ambitious house, pursued through political maneuvering, economic pressure, and strategic alliances. The logic behind this structure was to tie the economic self-interest of the great houses to the stability of the Imperium. By making them all shareholders in the same grand enterprise, it created a powerful incentive for cooperation. A war that disrupted trade would hurt everyone's CHOAM dividends. An act of rebellion that led to imperial sanction would mean the loss of lucrative directorships. Profit, in the CHOAM system, became a powerful instrument of policy. The emperor could reward loyal houses with favorable contracts and punish rebellious ones by cutting them out of the most profitable ventures. The system institutionalized a form of legalized favoritism. The most important commodity that CHOAM controlled was, of course, the spice melange. The contract to manage the mining operations on Arrakis was the single most valuable prize in the entire Imperium. The house that held the Arrakis fief was effectively granted a license to print money, but it also came with immense responsibility and immense risk. They were required to meet the spice quotas demanded by the Spacing Guild and the rest of the Imperium, a task made perilous by the planet's hostile environment and the giant sandworms that guarded the spice. CHOAM was the glue that bound the Emperor and the Landsraad together in a web of mutual economic dependency. It channeled the raw, competitive instincts of the nobility into the corporate boardroom, transforming potential military conflicts into battles fought over share prices and production quotas. While the Sardaukar provided the fear that kept the peace, and the Landsraad provided the forum that contained disputes, it was CHOAM that provided the profits that made the entire system worth preserving. The triangle of power was complete, a self-regulating machine of politics, force, and finance that would endure for millennia. Part 2. Mechanics of Rule. Chapter 7. How the Landsraad works. To an outside observer, the Landsraad could appear as a chaotic and ceremonial body, a forum for pompous speeches and arcane rituals. But beneath the surface of tradition and protocol lay a sophisticated and ruthless political machine. Its primary function was the preservation of aristocratic power, and its mechanisms were all geared toward that end. Understanding how the Landsraad truly worked requires looking beyond its formal sessions and into the backhall trades, the committee chambers, and the unwritten rules that governed the behavior of the great houses. The full Landsraad Council, known as the Great Assembly, convened only in times of extreme crisis or for major ceremonial events, such as the coronation of a new emperor. These sessions were largely for public display, a way to project an image of noble unity and purpose. The real work of the Landsraad was done in its committees and, most importantly, in the High Council. The High Council was the Landsraad's executive arm, a rotating body of delegates from the most powerful great houses. It was here that policies were debated, treaties were drafted, and judgments were rendered in disputes between houses. A seat on the High Council was a position of immense influence. It allowed a house to shape the legislative agenda, to steer economic policies in its favor, and to build powerful alliances. Competition for these seats was fierce and constant. Alliances, often sealed with marriage contracts between noble families, were the primary currency of Landsraad politics. A bloc of allied houses could dominate the High Council for generations, controlling key committees and effectively setting the course for the entire nobility. Houses like the Atreides, known for their honor and diplomatic skill, often found themselves at the center of these alliances, their reputation for fairness making them trusted leaders. Voting in the Landsraad was a complex affair. A house's voting strength was not based on a simple one vote per house system. Instead, it was a weighted measure of a house's faufreluche's rank, its economic power as measured by CHOAM holdings, and its military strength. This meant that the great houses wielded disproportionate influence, while the minor houses had to band together to make their voices heard. This system ensured that the established powers remained in control, but it also created a dynamic political environment where a clever minor house could gain influence by acting as a swing vote between larger, competing factions. Beyond the formal mechanisms of councils and votes, the Landsraad operated on a deep-seated culture of custom and honor. Unwritten rules often carried more weight than formal laws. A public insult to the honor of a house demanded a response. A promise made between nobles was expected to be kept, at least in letter if not in spirit. These customs, while seeming archaic, served a practical purpose. They created a predictable framework for interaction between powerful, armed, and paranoid rivals. They allowed for a degree of trust in a system where betrayal was always a possibility. The Landsraad's power was primarily negative. It was better at preventing things than at doing them. Its most potent weapon was the collective veto. If the emperor proposed a new tax, or a policy that the majority of the Landsraad opposed, they could simply refuse to implement it. Enforcing a decree against the united opposition of the nobility would require a massive military campaign, a risk not even the Corrinos were willing to take lightly. The Landsraad could also impose its own sanctions, declaring a member house an outcast, and authorizing a bill of particulars that allowed other houses to prey upon it without fear of retribution. This was the council's ultimate punishment, a political and economic death sentence. The ever-present threat of such a sanction was a powerful tool for enforcing conformity and punishing those who broke the delicate rules of their aristocratic game. Chapter 8. CHOAM, from Ledger to Leviathan. CHOAM was more than a company. It was the economic expression of the imperial power structure. Its ledgers told the true story of the Imperium, a story of wealth, greed, and the use of finance as a weapon. While the Landsraad debated matters of honor and law, the real battles for dominance were fought in the CHOAM boardroom, where directorships were the thrones and share blocks were the armies. The company's evolution from a simple trade combine into a political Leviathan was a testament to the idea that in the Imperium, all power was ultimately economic. The core of CHOAM's power lay in its shareholding structure. The emperor and his imperial house held the largest single block of shares, but it was not a controlling majority. The great houses of the Landsraad, collectively, held a larger percentage. This created a permanent state of economic tension. The emperor needed the support of some great houses to control CHOAM policy, and the great houses needed to form coalitions to counter the emperor's influence. This delicate balance of ownership was the key to the entire system. It forced both sides into a state of perpetual negotiation and compromise, preventing either the throne or the nobility from achieving absolute economic dominance. A directorship in CHOAM was the most sought-after prize for any great house. A director had a say in the management of the company's vast assets, from the mining rights on 1,000 worlds to the lucrative contracts for terraforming and infrastructure. A director could steer business toward his own house and away from his rivals. He could gain access to sensitive economic intelligence, learning of resource shortages or market shifts before anyone else. This inside knowledge was often more valuable than a fleet of frigates. The appointment of directors was a subject of intense political maneuvering, with the emperor and the various Landsraad factions constantly vying to place their allies in these key positions. CHOAM's operations were vast and complex. It managed planetary concessions, effectively leasing out entire worlds to great houses for development and exploitation. The house holding the concession would be responsible for administering the planet, developing its resources, and paying a percentage of the profits back to CHOAM. The Arrakis fief was the most extreme example of this system. but it was replicated on a smaller scale across the Imperium. This system of legalized favoritism was central to the emperor's power. He could grant a lucrative concession to a loyal house as a reward, or strip a rebellious house of its primary source of income as a punishment. The company also played a crucial role in auditing the finances of the great houses. CHOAM auditors had the right to inspect the books of any planetary fief, ensuring that the company and the emperor were receiving their proper share of the revenue. This was a powerful tool of intimidation. An audit could be used to uncover corruption or smuggling, providing the emperor with a legal pretext to move against a troublesome house. For this reason, every great house maintained two sets of books: the official ledger for the CHOAM auditors and the secret one that recorded the true state of their finances, including their illicit smuggling operations and hidden assets. Smuggling was the shadow economy that mirrored CHOAM's official trade. While CHOAM controlled the legal flow of goods, a vast and sophisticated black market thrived in the margins. Even the most honorable houses engaged in some level of smuggling to avoid CHOAM tariffs and to build up secret reserves of wealth. This illicit trade was an open secret, tolerated by the emperor as long as it did not grow large enough to threaten CHOAM's overall profitability or the stability of the imperial economy. It was yet another layer in the complex game of power, a way for houses to hedge their bets and operate outside the formal structures of imperial control. Chapter 9. Emperor's Balancing Act. The Padishah Emperor of the known universe was, in theory, an absolute monarch. In practice, his power was a constant, delicate balancing act. The emperor could not rule by force alone. The Imperium was too vast, and the great houses of the Landsraad were too powerful and proud. To maintain the Golden Lion throne, the Corrino dynasty perfected a strategy of divide and rule, of balancing terror with theater, and of using the other great powers of the Imperium as counterweights to one another. The emperor's primary role was not to command, but to manage the equilibrium. The first and most important principle of imperial rule was to prevent any single great house from becoming too powerful. The Corrinos were masters at playing the houses against one another. They would secretly encourage rivalries, subtly supporting one house in a dispute to weaken another. They used their control over CHOAM directorships and planetary fiefs to create economic dependencies and jealousies. A house on the rise might find its shipping rights curtailed, or its most profitable contract awarded to a rival, a clear signal from the throne to check its ambition. This constant management of inter-house conflict kept the nobility focused on their own squabbles and prevented them from uniting against the emperor. The Sardaukar were the ultimate instrument in this balancing act. Their existence was a constant, implicit threat. While the emperor rarely deployed them in full legion strength against a great house, the fear of them was ever present. More often, they were used covertly. Small teams of Sardaukar, often disguised as mercenaries or soldiers of another house, could be used for sabotage, assassination, or to covertly aid one side in a conflict. This allowed the emperor to intervene decisively while maintaining plausible deniability. The mystery surrounding the Sardaukar's full capabilities and their precise numbers was a weapon in itself, forcing every house to factor the emperor's ultimate military superiority into their calculations. But terror alone was not enough. The emperor also had to project an aura of legitimacy and majesty. The imperial court on Khitan was the center of galactic society, a dazzling spectacle of wealth, power, and ceremony. The emperor used this pageantry as a tool of statecraft. Invitations to court functions, imperial honors, and royal marriages were used to reward loyalists and to co-opt potential rivals. A marriage between a Corrino princess and the heir of a powerful great house could turn a potential enemy into a family member, binding them to the throne with ties of blood and obligation. This theater of power reinforced the idea that the emperor was not just another warlord, but the rightful, divinely ordained ruler of the universe. The emperor also had to balance the power of the Landsraad against the power of the Spacing Guild. The guild's monopoly on travel made them a potential threat, but also a useful counterweight to the nobility. The emperor and the guild shared a common interest in stability and the uninterrupted flow of trade. The throne often sided with the guild in disputes with the Landsraad over shipping fees or spice quotas, reinforcing the guild's neutrality and preventing the houses from gaining too much leverage over the transport system. In return, the guild's refusal to become involved in political conflicts helped the emperor isolate and deal with rebellious houses, one at a time. This intricate dance of power required a long-term perspective and a deep understanding of the complex web of relationships that held the Imperium together. The Corrino emperors survived for 10 millennia because they understood that their power was not absolute. It was conditional, dependent on their ability to manipulate the other pieces on the board. They were the arbiters of a system designed to be in a permanent state of controlled conflict, a system that only they, from their position at the apex, could manage. Their rule was a masterful performance, balancing on the knife's edge between consent and coercion. Chapter 10. Canley and Assassination Law. In a society as rigid and honor-bound as the Imperium's aristocracy, insults and grievances were inevitable. Without a mechanism to resolve these disputes, the feudal structure would have quickly collapsed into endless, widespread warfare. The solution, codified in the Great Convention and refined over centuries of practice, was Canley. This formal code of vendetta was one of the most paradoxical and essential institutions of the Imperium. It was a law that stabilized society by permitting and regulating murder. Canley was a declaration of a private war between two houses. Once a vendetta was formally declared, specific individuals within the rival houses became legitimate targets for assassination. However, the rules of Canley were strict and severe. The conflict was to be contained to the combatants only. Harming innocent bystanders or neutral parties was a grave offense, one that could turn the rest of the Landsraad against the offending house. The goal of Canley was to satisfy honor and eliminate a rival, not to cause mass casualties or disrupt the economic life of the Imperium. The primary tool of Canley was the assassin. The Imperium had a thriving industry of professional assassins, many trained in specialized schools that taught the arts of stealth, poison, and personal combat. When a house decided to prosecute a Canley vendetta, it would often hire these specialists. The use of assassins served a dual purpose. It kept the violence precise and limited, and it provided a layer of plausible deniability. If an assassination attempt failed, the employing house could disavow the agent, claiming they were a rogue element. The law surrounding assassination was incredibly detailed. Certain weapons and methods were proscribed. The use of poisons, for example, was governed by complex rules regarding their traceability and the manner of their delivery. A key element of this culture was the emphasis on the slow blade. While projectile weapons and explosives existed, true artistry in assassination and in personal combat generally was associated with the knife. This was partly a result of the development of personal body shields, which could stop a fast-moving projectile, but were vulnerable to a slow, penetrating blade. This technological reality elevated knife fighting to a high art form and made personal combat a deadly, intimate affair. The system also included formal mechanisms for resolving a Canley feud. A neutral third party, often another great house or a representative of the emperor, could be called in to act as a mediator. If both sides agreed, the vendetta could be settled through a formal duel between champions of the two houses. These duels were highly ritualized events, governed by their own strict set of protocols. The outcome was binding, and the losing house was expected to consider the matter of honor settled. This provided an off-ramp, a way to end a feud before it became too costly in blood and treasure. The ultimate effect of Canley was to create a deterrence calculus. Before embarking on a course of action that would offend another house, A prudent leader had to weigh the potential gains against the risk of triggering a vendetta. Canley forced the ambitious and the ruthless to be cautious and precise. It was cheaper and safer to achieve one's goals through economic pressure or political intrigue than through actions that would lead to a blood feud. In this way, the law of assassination paradoxically reduced the overall level of violence in the Imperium. It channeled the aggressive instincts of the nobility into a predictable, manageable, and ultimately stable system of ritualized conflict. It was a brutal form of justice, but it was a form of justice that the great houses understood and respected. Chapter 11. Provincial Economies and Spice Tributaries. The Imperium was, at its heart, a resource extraction empire. The vast wealth that flowed through C.H.O.A.M's accounts and funded the lavish lifestyles of the nobility and the emperor was generated on thousands of provincial worlds, each with its own unique economy. These planetary economies were the tributaries that fed the great river of imperial commerce. They were managed as fiefdoms by the great and minor houses, who held their worlds as a sacred trust and a source of immense profit. Each planetary fief had a specialized economy based on its natural resources and the skills of its population. Some worlds were primarily agricultural, breadbaskets that fed the more industrialized planets. Others were centers of manufacturing, producing everything from luxury goods to military hardware. Planets rich in rare metals or unique chemical compounds became hubs of mining and refinement. The house ruling a planet was responsible for managing its economy, ensuring production quotas were met, and collecting the taxes and tariffs that constituted its income. A portion of this income had to be paid as a tribute, or tithe, to the emperor and to C.H.O.A.M. This was the primary mechanism of imperial taxation. The amount of the tithe was determined by the planet's economic output and was a constant subject of negotiation and dispute. A clever planetary governor could hide profits and underreport production to minimize his tax burden, while the ever-watchful C.H.O.A.M auditors sought to ensure the company received its full due. This constant economic friction was a central feature of the relationship between the central government and its provincial rulers. The most important of all these tributaries was the one that flowed from the desert planet of Arrakis. The spice melange was not just another commodity, it was the foundation of the entire imperial system. Its geriatric properties extended the lives of the wealthy, making it a luxury good of unparalleled value. Its consciousness-expanding effects were used by the Bene Gesserit for their rituals, and by the Mentats to enhance their cognitive abilities. Most critically, it was the substance that enabled the Spacing Guild navigators to guide their ships through space. Without a steady supply of spice, the Imperium would grind to a halt. The house that controlled Arrakis was therefore in a position of unique power and peril. The profits from the spice trade were astronomical, capable of making the ruling house the wealthiest in the Landsraad. But the responsibility was immense. They had to meet the spice quotas demanded by the Guild, C.H.O.A.M, and the Emperor. Failure to do so would bring the wrath of the entire Imperium down upon them. The cost of spice mining was also enormous. The specialized equipment required to harvest the spice from the deep desert, the massive carryalls to transport the harvesters, and the constant need to defend the operations from the giant sandworms all consumed vast amounts of capital. The flow of spice from Arrakis to the rest of the Imperium was a carefully managed process. The ruling house would sell its spice production to C.H.O.A.M at a negotiated price. C.H.O.A.M would then sell the spice to its various customers, the Guild, the other great houses, and pharmaceutical companies at a significant markup. The profits were then distributed among the C.H.O.A.M shareholders, with the Emperor and the ruling house of Arrakis taking the largest shares. This system ensured that all the major powers had a vested interest in the continued exploitation of Arrakis. The spice was the ultimate tributary, the single stream of wealth upon which the entire imperial economy depended. Its scarcity and the difficulty of its extraction was what gave it its immense value and its central role in the politics of power. Chapter 12. The Arrakis exception. In the meticulously ordered universe of the Imperium, where the Faufreluche's system dictated every person's place, and the Great Convention governed the actions of the powerful, Arrakis was the great exception. On this one desert planet, nearly every rule of imperial society was bent or broken. Its unique ecology, its marginalized native population, and its singular, priceless resource created a reality that defied easy categorization and constantly challenged the stability of the imperial power structure. Arrakis was the fulcrum upon which the entire Imperium balanced. The source of this exception was the planet's ecology. Arrakis was a world consumed by sand and heat, a place where water was more valuable than any precious metal. This brutal environment was dominated by the life cycle of a single, colossal creature, the sandworm, or Shai-Hulud. These giant beings, some hundreds of meters long, roamed the deep deserts. They were drawn by rhythmic vibrations and would attack and destroy anything that produced them, making conventional mining and transportation impossible in the open desert. The sandworms were the true rulers of Arrakis. The spice melange was a byproduct of the sandworm life cycle. In their larval stage, the sand trout, they would encapsulate pockets of water deep beneath the desert surface. This would eventually lead to a massive buildup of pressure and a chemical reaction that would explode to the surface, a spice blow. The resulting material, exposed to the sun and air, would become the precious melange. This inextricable link between the terrifying worms and the priceless spice meant that one could not be had without the other. The very thing that made harvesting the spice so dangerous was also what created it. This ecological reality was an absolute constraint on any power that sought to control Arrakis. This harsh world was also home to a human population that lived outside the formal Faufreluche system, the Fremen. Descendants of ancient religious wanderers, the Fremen had adapted to the desert with a cultural and technological sophistication that the Imperium failed to recognize. They had developed the stillsuit, a full-body filtration system that reclaimed nearly all the body's moisture, allowing them to survive in the open desert. They lived in hidden communities called sieches and had a fierce, independent culture centered on their own religious beliefs, which included the prophesied arrival of a messiah from off-world. The Imperium, in its arrogance, viewed the Fremen as little more than primitive savages, a nuisance to be managed or eliminated. They were not counted in the imperial census, had no representation in the Landsraad, and were considered outside the protection of imperial law. This marginalization was a profound mistake. The Fremen did not just survive in the desert. They had mastered it. They understood the sandworms, could even ride them, and had developed their own form of warfare perfectly suited to the environment. They were a vast, untapped military resource, a hidden army waiting for a leader. On Arrakis, the normal rules of power were inverted. The technological might of the great houses was blunted by the planet's environment. The legal structures of the Imperium had no hold over the Fremen. The wealth generated by the spice was a constant source of instability, tempting the other houses and the Emperor into acts of treachery and greed. Arrakis was a place of paradoxes, a wasteland that was the source of all wealth, a primitive people who were the most skilled survivors in the universe, and a planet whose ecology dictated the fate of a galactic empire. Every great house that came to rule Arrakis learned the same hard lesson. The desert could not be conquered. It could only be endured. And in the end, the desert always won. Part 3. The Atreides Harkonnen Crisis. Chapter 13. Transfer of Fief. In the 10,000th year of the Corrino dynasty, Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV made a decision that would shatter the long-standing equilibrium of the Imperium. He ordered the transfer of the planetary fief of Arrakis. The incumbent rulers, the cruel and fabulously wealthy House Harkonnen, were to be replaced by their ancient rivals, the honorable and popular House Atreides, On the surface, this was a standard, if major, exercise of imperial prerogative. In reality, it was the opening move in a complex and deadly trap, a gambit that would have unforeseen and catastrophic consequences for all involved. The official reason for the transfer was a matter of imperial policy. House Atreides, under the leadership of the charismatic Duke Leto, had become too popular and influential within the Landsraad. The Duke's skill in diplomacy and his reputation for justice had earned him the loyalty of many other houses, both great and minor. He was beginning to command a voting bloc in the High Council that could potentially challenge the Emperor's own authority. C.H.O.A.M IV, a paranoid and insecure ruler, saw this growing influence as a direct threat to his throne. He needed to move against the Atreides, but he could not do so openly without risking a full-scale rebellion by the Landsraad. The transfer of Arrakis was the perfect solution to his problem. It appeared to be a great honor, a reward for the Atreides' loyal service. The spice fief was the most lucrative prize in the Imperium, and granting it to the Atreides seemed to elevate them to the highest echelons of power. This public gesture would mollify the Duke's allies in the Landsraad and make the Emperor appear generous and even-handed. But beneath this facade of favor lay a pit of vipers. The Emperor knew that House Harkonnen, led by the grotesquely cunning Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, would not surrender their prize without a fight. The Harkonnens had ruled Arrakis for 80 years, growing obscenely rich from the spice while systematically brutalizing the population and pocketing a significant portion of the profits for themselves. To be stripped of this source of wealth was an intolerable blow to their power and prestige. The Baron, a master of treachery, would inevitably move to retake the planet. The Emperor was not just allowing this, he was counting on it. The plan, concocted in secret between the Emperor and Baron Harkonnen, was simple. The Atreides would be forced to move their entire household and military from their ancestral home of Caladan to the hostile desert of Arrakis. This would stretch their resources, leave them isolated from their allies, and place them in an unfamiliar and dangerous environment. Once they were established, the Harkonnens, secretly aided by the Emperor's own elite, Sardaukar, disguised in Harkonnen uniforms, would launch a massive surprise attack. The Atreides, caught between the Harkonnen legions and the Emperor's hidden Sardaukar, would be annihilated. For the Emperor, the plan was flawless. House Atreides would be destroyed, removing a political rival. House Harkonnen would be restored to power on Arrakis, but they would be indebted to the Emperor for his assistance and weakened by the cost of the invasion, making them less of a future threat. The rest of the Landsraad would see the event as just another bloody chapter in the long-running feud between two houses, a tragic but legal outcome under the rules of Canley. The Emperor's own involvement would remain a closely guarded secret. The transfer of the fief was not an administrative decision. It was a carefully calibrated assassination of an entire great house, using the rules and structures of the Imperium itself as the murder weapon. The board was set, and the pieces were in motion. Chapter 14. CHOAM Maneuvers. The conflict between the Atreides and the Harkonnens was not only fought on the battlefield, it was waged with equal ferocity in the financial heart of the Imperium, the CHOAM Company. The transfer of the Arrakis fief triggered a series of complex economic maneuvers, as both houses sought to use the mechanisms of galactic commerce to gain an advantage and undermine their rival. The battle for Arrakis was a battle for control of CHOAM's most valuable asset, and the company itself became a key arena of the conflict. When Duke Leto Atreides took control of Arrakis, he inherited not only the planet, but also the CHOAM directorship that came with it. This gave him a seat at the highest table of imperial commerce, but it also placed him in a precarious financial position. The Harkonnens, during their long tenure, had engaged in a practice known as skimming. They had secretly stockpiled vast quantities of spice, far beyond what they reported to C.H.O.A.M and the Emperor. This gave them a massive, off-the-books reserve of wealth. Before departing Arrakis, they had also systematically sabotaged much of the mining equipment, leaving it in a state of barely functional disrepair. Duke Leto was faced with an immediate crisis. He had to spend enormous sums of money to repair and replace the damaged equipment just to get spice production back to the levels required to meet his quotas. The startup costs of the new operation were crippling, draining the Atreides treasury at an alarming rate. This was a deliberate part of the Harkonnen strategy. They knew that by forcing the Atreides into a position of financial distress, they would make them more vulnerable to attack. A house struggling to make payroll is a house whose soldiers are less loyal and whose defenses are less vigilant. Baron Harkonnen, meanwhile, used his hidden spice fortune to launch an economic assault. He began to subtly flood the market with his stockpiled spice, driving down the price. This had a devastating effect on the Atreides. With the market price of spice falling, the revenue they were generating from their legitimate mining operations was less than they had projected, pushing them further into debt. The Baron also used his influence within CHOAM, calling in favors and bribing other directors to block any attempts by the Atreides to secure loans or financial relief from the company. The Atreides were being financially isolated and strangled. Duke Leto was not a fool. He understood the economic game that was being played. He attempted to counter the Harkonnen strategy by seeking out new, unconventional sources of wealth on Arrakis. He recognized the potential of the Fremen, not just as fighters, but as a source of immense hidden wealth. He knew the Fremen paid no heed to CHOAM and had their own secret methods for harvesting and stockpiling spice. An alliance with the Fremen could potentially give him access to a vast, untaxed source of the melange, enough to stabilize his financial position and turn the tables on the Harkonnens. This economic warfare was conducted with a veneer of legality and plausible deniability. From the outside, it looked like normal market fluctuations and corporate politics. The falling price of spice could be attributed to a sudden surplus. The denial of loans to the Atreides could be justified by their mounting debts, but to those on the inside, the pattern was clear. It was a coordinated campaign to bankrupt House Atreides before the military invasion even began. The ledgers of CHOAM were as much a part of the battlefield as the sands of Arrakis, and the fight for profits was a fight to the death. Chapter 15. Landsraad Silence and Complicity. The destruction of a great house was not a small matter. The Landsraad was designed, in principle, to prevent such an event, to provide collective security against the aggression of a single ambitious house, or even the Emperor himself. Yet, as the Harkonnens, with the secret backing of the Emperor, prepared their assault on House Atreides, the great council of the nobility remained silent. This silence was not a sign of ignorance, but of complicity. It was a demonstration of how the procedures and traditions of the Landsraad could be manipulated to mask an orchestrated political assassination. Many of the great houses were aware, or at least suspected, that the transfer of Arrakis to the Atreides was a trap. The rivalry between the Atreides and the Harkonnens was ancient and bitter. The Emperor's sudden favor toward Duke Leto seemed too good to be true, but suspicion was not proof. And in the formal, legalistic world of the Landsraad, proof was everything. The Emperor and the Baron had been careful to operate within the letter of the law. The transfer of a fief was an imperial right. A canly feud between two houses was a legally sanctioned affair. As long as these forms were observed, the other houses had no official grounds to intervene. There were other, less noble reasons for their silence. Greed and jealousy played a significant role. Duke Leto Atreides' popularity was a source of envy for many other ambitious lords. They saw his potential downfall as an opportunity to improve their own standing. The destruction of a major power like the Atreides would create a vacuum, opening up positions on the High Council and opportunities within CHOAM. Some houses were actively, if secretly, colluding with the Harkonnens, hoping to receive a share of the spoils after the Atreides were eliminated. Fear was another powerful motivator. The other great houses were acutely aware of the emperor's power and the terrifying might of his Sardaukar. Even if they had wanted to come to the aid of the Atreides, to do so would be to risk the wrath of the throne. A house that openly defied the emperor's will could find itself the next target. It was safer to remain neutral, to express formal regrets after the fact, and to hope that the emperor's attention would not turn toward them. The collective security principle of the Landsraad had been eroded by a collective sense of self-preservation. The Atreides were not without allies, but these allies were rendered powerless by the political situation. Houses that had pledged their support to Duke Leto found themselves diplomatically and logistically isolated. The Spacing Guild, maintaining its strict neutrality, would not provide transport for any relief force without the express permission of the emperor. The costs of mounting a military expedition to a distant world like Arrakis were prohibitive without the support of a wider coalition. The Duke's friends in the Landsraad could offer words of support and warnings through secret channels, but they could not offer material aid. The system was working exactly as the emperor had intended, isolating his target from the herd. The silence of the Landsraad was a testament to the decay of its founding ideals. The council that had been created to prevent the tyranny of one over the many had become a tool for enabling it. Its procedures, designed to ensure fairness and stability, were used to provide a legal cover for an act of naked aggression. The complicity of the great houses demonstrated a hard truth of imperial politics. When faced with a choice between collective honor and individual survival, most would choose survival. The Atreides were on their own, abandoned by the very institution that was sworn to protect them. Chapter 16. Sardaukar in disguise. The Harkonnen invasion of Arrakis was planned as a swift, overwhelming blow designed to decapitate the Atreides leadership and crush their forces before they could mount an effective defense. The Harkonnen legions were formidable, but Duke Leto's army, though smaller, was known for its superb training and unwavering loyalty. To guarantee victory, Baron Harkonnen needed an edge, a force that could break the back of the Atreides' elite troops. That edge was provided by the Emperor himself, in the form of 2 full legions of his Sardaukar terror troops. The involvement of the Sardaukar had to be kept absolutely secret. If it became known that the Padishah Emperor had used his personal army to aid one great house in the destruction of another, the Landsraad would be forced to unite against him. It would be a clear violation of the Great Convention, an act of imperial tyranny that could not be ignored. The resulting civil war would tear the Imperium apart. Therefore, the Sardaukar were deployed under the deepest cover, their true identity hidden from the universe. The Sardaukar legions were transported to Arrakis secretly, their ships disguised as ordinary commercial freighters. Once on the planet, they were quartered in hidden bases in the polar regions, far from the prying eyes of Atreides' reconnaissance. For the invasion itself, they were equipped with Harkonnen uniforms and used Harkonnen weapons. They fought alongside the Baron's troops, their movements and communications integrated with the Harkonnen command structure. To any outside observer, they would be indistinguishable from the regular Harkonnen forces. But on the battlefield, their true nature was revealed. The Sardaukar fought with a ferocity and skill that was far beyond that of any normal Landsraad soldier. They were the ones who broke through the toughest Atreides defensive positions, who led the charge against the Duke's command citadel in the city of Arrakis. The Atreides soldiers, some of the best in the Imperium, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed almost superhuman. The presence of the Sardaukar turned what should have been a hard-fought battle into a one-sided slaughter. The key to the entire operation was the betrayal of the Atreides by one of their own, the Suk doctor, Wellington Yue. The Harkonnens, through extreme psychological manipulation and by holding his wife hostage, had broken Yue's imperial conditioning, which was thought to be unbreakable. He was the one who lowered the shields of the Atreides palace at the critical moment, allowing the Harkonnen and Sardaukar forces to pour in. This act of treachery from within was the final, decisive element that sealed the Atreides' fate. Despite the secrecy, the limits of this strategy were clear. The Sardaukar were a finite resource. The Emperor could not deploy them everywhere at once. Their use on Arrakis was a calculated risk, a massive expenditure of his most valuable military asset. Furthermore, it was impossible to keep such a large-scale operation completely secret forever. Some of the Atreides' forces, including the Duke's trusted swordmaster Duncan Idaho and his master-at-arms Gurney Halleck, managed to survive the initial onslaught and escape into the desert. They had witnessed the fighting firsthand and knew that the soldiers who had overwhelmed them were no ordinary Harkonnens. The rumor of Sardaukar involvement began to spread, a whisper of imperial treachery that would eventually find its way to the ears of the other great houses. The Emperor's fingerprints were on the weapon that had killed Duke Leto. While he had achieved his short-term goal of eliminating a rival, he had also planted the seeds of his own destruction. He had shown the rest of the Imperium that he was willing to break the most sacred rules of their society to maintain his power, a revelation that would come back to haunt him. Chapter 17. Collapse of the Old Equilibrium. The successful Harkonnen invasion of Arrakis, backed by the secret power of the Emperor, should have restored the old order. House Atreides was shattered, their duke dead, their army defeated. House Harkonnen was back in control of the spice, and the Emperor's primary political rival had been eliminated. By all accounts, the equilibrium of the Imperium, which had been temporarily disturbed by the rise of Duke Leto, should have been re-established. But the architects of the Atreides' downfall had made a fatal miscalculation. They had failed to account for two survivors, the Duke's Bene Gesserit consort, the Lady Jessica, and their young son Paul. Jessica and Paul, cast out into the deep desert to die, were rescued by the Fremen. This was the moment that the old equilibrium truly collapsed. For the first time, a member of a great house, and one trained in the advanced mental and physical disciplines of the Bene Gesserit, made contact with the vast, hidden society of the Fremen. The Fremen, long dismissed as a marginal and primitive people, were revealed to be a highly organized, technologically sophisticated, and ferociously disciplined society numbering in the millions. They were the desert power that the Harkonnens and the Emperor had never bothered to understand. The Harkonnen rule on Arrakis had been based on brutal exploitation. They cared only for maximizing spice production at the lowest possible cost. They saw the Fremen as a resource to be exterminated. This approach had created a deep and abiding hatred for the Harkonnens among the desert people. Paul and Jessica arrived among them not as conquerors, but as refugees, sharing a common enemy. More than that, they arrived as potential fulfillments of the Fremen's deeply held religious prophecies, which had been planted there centuries before by the Bene Gesserit's Missionaria Protectiva. The prophecy spoke of a Messiah, the Lisan al-Gaib, or voice from the outer world, who would come to lead them to paradise. Paul Atreides, with his Bene Gesserit training and his nascent, prescient abilities, awakened by the intense spice exposure on Arrakis, began to fit this messianic role perfectly. He learned the ways of the Fremen, mastered their methods of survival and combat, and proved himself in their rituals. He was not just an outsider seeking their help, he was becoming one of them. He taught them the weirding way, the Bene Gesserit combat art, which, when combined with their own formidable fighting skills, turned them into an army of super soldiers. The moment that insurgency met monopoly economics, the entire power structure of the Imperium became obsolete. The Harkonnens could control the cities and the spaceports, but they could not control the desert. Paul, now known among the Fremen as Muad'Dib, began to lead a highly effective guerrilla war against the Harkonnen spice operations. Fremen warriors, appearing as if from nowhere out of the sand, would strike at the spice harvesters, destroying the massively expensive equipment and disappearing back into the desert before the Harkonnen forces could respond. spice production began to plummet. The Harkonnens, under immense pressure from the Emperor and the Spacing Guild to meet their quotas, were forced to pour more and more money and manpower into defending their operations, with diminishing returns. The flow of the Imperium's most vital commodity was being choked off at its source, not by a rival great house or by a shift in CHOAM policy, but by an indigenous insurgency led by the heir of the very house the Emperor had sought to destroy. The old game of checks and balances was over. A new power had emerged from the sands of Arrakis, a power that did not play by the rules of the Landsraad or the Emperor, and it was about to bring the entire galactic empire to its knees. Chapter 18. Paul's Leverage. The power that Paul Atreides wielded was unlike any that the Imperium had ever seen. It was not based on CHOAM shares, or Landsraad votes, or even on the number of legions he commanded. It was a new kind of power, a synthesis of three distinct elements that, when combined, gave him absolute leverage over the entire imperial system. His power came from his control of the Fremen, his developing prescient abilities, and his unique understanding of the ecological and political realities of Arrakis. First and foremost was his leadership of the Fremen. By uniting the disparate tribes and honing them into a disciplined and fanatically loyal army, he had created a military force perfectly adapted to the only battlefield that now mattered, Arrakis. The Fremen, fighting on their home turf, were more than a match for the Harkonnen garrisons and even for the dreaded Sardaukar. They could live off the land, ride the great sandworms as cavalry, and use the desert itself as their greatest weapon. They were an army that could not be defeated by conventional means, because they could not be cornered or contained. Their control of the deep desert gave Paul effective control over the source of all spice. Second was Paul's prescience. The constant exposure to spice on Arrakis had awakened and amplified the genetic potential that the Bene Gesserit breeding program had cultivated in his bloodline for 90 generations. He had become the Kwisatz Haderach, the male Bene Gesserit, who could see through time. His visions were not always clear or complete, but they gave him a decisive strategic advantage. He could foresee his enemies' moves, identify their weaknesses, and see the critical paths to victory. Prescience transformed warfare into a kind of logistical equation. He knew where to strike, when to retreat, and how to position his forces for maximum effect. It was an advantage against which there was no defense. Finally, Paul understood the ultimate source of all power, on Arrakis, the sandworms. He learned from the Fremen, the deep ecological secret of the planet, that the spice and the worms were part of the same life cycle. He realized that the sandworms, the creatures that everyone feared and sought to avoid, were not just an obstacle to spice production, but the key to controlling it. He developed a plan not just to disrupt the spice flow, but to destroy it entirely. By using the Fremen's secret knowledge, he knew he could trigger a chemical reaction that would poison the larval sandworms, the sand trout, and thus end the spice cycle forever. This was his ultimate trump card, the threat that gave him absolute power. He could destroy the spice. The threat was credible because he had the means, the Fremen and their knowledge, and the motive, revenge and the creation of a new order. The mere possibility that he could and would do this was enough to checkmate the entire Imperium. The Spacing Guild, faced with the extinction of the substance that gave them their powers and their monopoly, would be forced to obey him. The Emperor and the great houses, faced with the collapse of the entire galactic economy and social order, would have no choice but to bow to his demands. He had turned the principle of scarcity into a weapon of absolute power. For millennia, the great houses had fought over control of the spice. Paul was the first to realize that the power to destroy it was infinitely greater than the power to control its distribution. With the Fremen as his army, prescience as his guide, and ecological annihilation as his ultimate threat, the young, dispossessed duke of a fallen house was poised to challenge the Padishah emperor for the Golden Lion throne itself. The final confrontation was at hand. Part 4. Rewriting the Compact. Chapter 19. From Emperor to Emperor. The culmination of Paul Atreides' war against the Harkonnens and the Emperor came at the Battle of Arrakis. In a lightning assault, his Fremen forces, riding giant sandworms over the shield wall, overwhelmed the combined Harkonnen and Imperial Sardaukar legions garrisoning the capital city. It was a stunning military victory that shattered the myth of Sardaukar invincibility. With the city taken, Paul had Emperor C.H.O.A.M. IV, his court, and the leadership of the Spacing Guild cornered and trapped. The balance of power in the universe shifted in a single day. But Paul's victory was not merely military. It was legal and political. He did not simply declare himself the new ruler. Instead, he used the traditions and laws of the Imperium to legitimize his ascension, performing a kind of political metamorphosis in full view of the assembled powers. He confronted C.H.O.A.M. IV not as a rebel, but as the rightful Duke of Arrakis, prosecuting a canly vendetta against the Emperor for his role in the destruction of House Atreides. This framed his actions not as treason, but as a matter of ducal justice, a concept the Landsraad could understand. He challenged the Emperor's champion, Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, to a formal duel, a trial by combat for the throne itself. By killing Feyd-Rautha in single ritual combat, he not only eliminated the last of the Harkonnen line, but also demonstrated his personal superiority in a way that the feudal aristocracy was bound to respect. He had proven his right to rule by the ancient law of the blade. His final move was a masterstroke of political strategy. He announced his intention to marry the Emperor's eldest daughter, the Princess Irulan. This was not a matter of love, but of law. By marrying Irulan, he would legally join House Atreides to House Corrino. His ascension to the throne would not be a conquest, but a legitimate transfer of power through marriage, securing the Corrino line, at least in name. This provided a crucial veneer of continuity and legitimacy, making it much more difficult for the other great houses of the Landsraad to oppose him. He was not destroying the imperial house, but absorbing it. Throughout this process, his ultimate weapon remained in the background, his threat to destroy the spice. The Spacing Guild, terrified by this prospect, immediately sided with him, guaranteeing that no great house could bring troops to Arrakis to challenge his claim. He had cut the Emperor and his potential allies off from any hope of reinforcement. The Landsraad, faced with a fait accompli, Paul in control of Arrakis, the Guild on his side, and a legitimate claim to the throne through marriage, had no choice but to acquiesce. They could either accept Paul Atreides as their new emperor, or face the end of civilization as they knew it. The legal metamorphosis of sovereignty was complete. Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, the Duke of Arrakis, the Messiah of the Fremen, the Kwisatz Haderach, sat upon the Golden Lion throne. But he was a new kind of emperor. His power did not derive from a 10,000-year-old dynasty or a precarious balance of competing interests. It was absolute, based on religious fanaticism, military supremacy on the one planet that mattered, and a monopoly not just on the spice, but on the very future of the Imperium. The old compact between the throne, the Landsraad, and C.H.O.A.M. was broken. A new, more centralized, and far more dangerous era had begun. Chapter 20. C.H.O.A.M. under new management. With Paul Atreides on the throne, the fundamental nature of the imperial economy changed overnight. C.H.O.A.M., the great mercantile corporation that had for so long served as the battleground for the competing interests of the Emperor and the Landsraad, was brought to heel. It was no longer a semi-independent entity governed by a board of powerful shareholders. It became a direct instrument of the new emperor's will, its vast resources repurposed to serve his absolute authority. The company was now under new management, and the new management had a very different set of priorities. Paul's control over C.H.O.A.M. was total because his control over its most valuable asset was total. As the sole undisputed master of Arrakis, he now controlled the entire supply of the spice melange. He could set the price, determine the quotas, and decide who received it and who did not. This gave him a power that no previous emperor had ever possessed. Shaddam IV had been the largest single shareholder in CHOAM, but he still had to negotiate with the other directors. Paul did not need to negotiate. His edicts were now company policy. The first and most dramatic change was in the distribution of wealth. Paul used his control of CHOAM to reward his followers and consolidate his power base. The Fremen, for the first time in their history, became fabulously wealthy. Their leaders granted significant shares in the profits from the spice they had for so long guarded. The great houses that had been allied with the Atreides, or those who were quick to pledge their loyalty to the new regime, were granted favorable trade terms and lucrative contracts. Those who had been slow to recognize his authority, or who were suspected of harboring resentments, found their CHOAM dividends slashed and their access to spice severely restricted. This created immediate price shocks throughout the imperial economy. The cost of spice, for those not in the emperor's favor, skyrocketed, while the price of guild transport rose accordingly. Many houses found themselves on the brink of bankruptcy, unable to afford the spice necessary for life extension or the transport essential for trade. This economic pressure was a powerful tool of coercion. Paul could bring a rebellious planet to its knees without firing a single shot, simply by cutting off its spice supply. The risk of famine, both literal and economic, became a constant threat used to ensure compliance. The structure of CHOAM itself was altered. Paul appointed his loyal Fremen and Atreides retainers to the board of directors, replacing the old guard of nobles who had represented the interests of the Landsraad. The company's focus shifted from maximizing profit for its diverse shareholders to funding the apparatus of Paul's new government and his impending jihad. The vast revenues generated by the spice monopoly were funneled into building up the Fremen military, establishing the new religion of Muad'Dib across the galaxy, and financing the massive bureaucracy required to run a centralized empire. CHOAM was no longer a forum for compromise and competition. It was the personal treasury of the emperor. The subtle game of economic influence that had defined the old Imperium was over. Power was no longer a matter of owning the most shares, but of having the favor of the man who owned the source. The corporation that had once been a pillar of the balanced power structure had been transformed into a pillar of a new, absolute monarchy, its ledgers now recording not the shifting fortunes of a diverse aristocracy, but the singular, unchallenged will of a single ruler. Chapter 21. Landsraad reordered. The ascension of Paul Atreides to the imperial throne sent a shockwave through the Landsraad. The Council of Nobles, which had for millennia served as a powerful counterweight to the emperor, was rendered almost obsolete overnight. Its mechanisms of power, its voting blocks, its legal precedents, its traditions of canly and collective security were all predicated on a system of balanced power that no longer existed. Faced with an emperor who held absolute control over the spice, the spacing guild, and a fanatical army, the great houses had to adapt to a new and terrifying political reality. Paul's relationship with the Landsraad was one of dominance, not partnership. He did not seek their counsel or negotiate for their support. He issued decrees, and they were expected to obey. The High Council, once the epicenter of political power in the Imperium, was reduced to a largely ceremonial body, its pronouncements carrying weight only if they aligned with the emperor's wishes. The careful dance of alliances and rivalries that had defined Landsraad politics was replaced by a simple, brutal calculus: loyalty to the new emperor, or political and economic oblivion. The initial reaction of many great houses was one of quiet, sullen resistance. They were proud, ancient families who did not take kindly to being dictated to by a young usurper, even one with a legitimate claim to the throne. But any thoughts of organized opposition were quickly crushed. Paul used his control of CHOAM and the spice to make examples of those who defied him. A house that questioned his authority would find its spice shipments delayed or cut off entirely. Its trade routes would be closed, and its CHOAM dividends would vanish. This economic strangulation was swift and brutally effective. For those who had been openly allied with the Harkonnens or the previous emperor, the consequences were even more severe. Some houses were stripped of their titles and their fiefs, their assets seized by the new imperial government. Their leaders were forced into exile or, in some cases, executed for treason. This selective purging of the old guard sent a clear message to the rest of the nobility. The old rules were gone, and the price of disloyalty was annihilation. At the same time, Paul engaged in a program of selective rehabilitation. Houses that were quick to swear fealty to him and to embrace the new religion of Muad'Dib were rewarded. They were given the fiefs of the disgraced houses, granted new directorships in the reorganized CHOAM, and brought into the inner circle of the new imperial court. This strategy of reward and punishment effectively shattered the unity of the Landsraad, turning the houses against one another as they scrambled to secure a place in the new order. The very nature of aristocratic power was changed. For centuries, a house's strength had been measured by its military, its wealth, and its influence within the Landsraad. Now, the only measure that mattered was its proximity to the throne. The great houses were reduced from semi-independent feudal lords to provincial governors in a highly centralized empire. Their power was no longer inherent. It was delegated to them by the emperor, and it could be taken away at any time. The Landsraad continued to exist as a formal institution, but its spirit was broken. It was no longer a council of rivals, but a court of vassals. Chapter 22. The Jihad's Political Economy. Paul Muad'Dib's ascension was not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of a new, far more widespread one. From Arrakis, he unleashed his Fremen legions upon the galaxy in a great jihad, a holy war to enforce his rule and spread his religion. For 12 years, this galactic crusade raged, conquering thousands of worlds and resulting in the deaths of over 60 billion people. This was not a war of choice for Paul. His prescient vision had shown him that this jihad, as horrific as it was the only path available that did not lead to the ultimate extinction of humanity. The jihad was a logistical and economic undertaking of unprecedented scale, and it fundamentally reshaped the political economy of the Imperium. The engine of the jihad was Arrakis. The planet, now known as Dune, became the political and religious capital of the universe, and its resources were entirely dedicated to the war effort. The spice melange was the fuel of the campaign. Its revenues funded the construction of a massive war fleet, the production of weapons, and the payment of the vast bureaucracy needed to manage the conquered territories. Paul's monopoly on the spice meant he had a virtually limitless source of funds for his holy war. The logistics of the jihad were staggering, moving millions of fanatical Fremen warriors across the galaxy, supplying them on hostile worlds, and administering the planets they conquered required a level of centralized planning that the old Imperium could never have achieved. The Spacing Guild, its survival now completely dependent on Paul's goodwill, had no choice but to serve as the transport arm of the jihad. Guild highliners, which had once carried the goods of peaceful commerce, were repurposed to carry Fremen death commandos and the missionaries of the new religion. The political economy of the conquered worlds was radically transformed. The old noble rulers were often swept away, replaced by a new elite composed of loyal Fremen administrators and religious leaders from the Qizarate, the priesthood of Muad'Dib's religion. A new system of taxation and tribute was imposed, designed to extract the maximum amount of resources from the conquered planets to feed the ever-growing war machine. Industries were nationalized, and their production was redirected toward military needs. The economies of 1,000 worlds were reoriented to serve a single purpose: the continuation of the jihad. The religion of Muad'Dib was itself a powerful economic and political tool. It created a unifying ideology that bound the diverse populations of the Imperium together in a shared, fanatical devotion to the Emperor. The Gesserit priests served as political officers, ensuring loyalty and stamping out dissent. The pilgrimage to Dune, which became a central rite of the new religion, was also a major economic stimulus for the capital planet, and a way to further centralize control. Billions of pilgrims brought their wealth to Dune, further filling the imperial coffers. This new political economy was ruthlessly efficient, but incredibly brutal. It was a system of total mobilization, where every resource, human and material, was dedicated to the emperor's grand design. The old, decentralized feudal economy of CHOAM and the Landsraad was replaced by a centralized command economy geared for perpetual holy war. The Jihad was not just a military campaign. It was the violent birth of a new political and economic order, one built on the foundations of absolute faith, absolute power, and the absolute control of the one resource that mattered most. Chapter 23. Limits of Prescient Governance. Paul Atreides, as the Prescient Emperor, possessed a power that no ruler in human history had ever wielded. He could see the future. He could navigate the myriad paths of cause and effect, foreseeing the consequences of his actions and the plots of his enemies. This should have made him the perfect, omniscient ruler, capable of guiding humanity toward a golden age. Yet, the reality of his reign demonstrated the profound and tragic limits of prescient governance. Foresight, he discovered, did not erase the need for painful trade-offs, nor did it free him from the terrible weight of his own choices. The first limit of prescience was its very nature. The future was not a single, fixed path, but a constantly shifting landscape of probabilities. Paul's visions showed him possible futures, not certainties. To navigate this landscape, he had to constantly make choices, steering events toward less catastrophic outcomes. He was trapped by his own awareness, forced to choose between terrible options. The Jihad was the most horrifying example of this. He saw that allowing it to proceed would cost billions of lives, but he also saw that every alternative path led to an even greater disaster, stagnation, and eventual extinction for the human race. He was forced to choose the lesser of two apocalypses. Another limit was the sheer volume of information. The task of managing a galactic empire was immense. Even with his Mentat training and prescient abilities, Paul could not be everywhere at once or see every detail. He was forced to delegate authority to his administrators and his Gesserit priesthood. This created a new bureaucracy, one that was often just as corrupt and self-serving as the old one. The religion that had been intended to unite humanity in a common purpose became a tool of oppression and fanaticism in the hands of its priests, a development that Paul saw, but was often powerless to prevent without causing even greater instability. Prescience also created a prison of knowledge. By seeing the future, Paul was bound to it. His actions were constrained by the need to keep the timeline on the narrow path he had chosen. He lost his freedom of choice, becoming a slave to his own visions. This had a profound personal cost, alienating him from those he loved and trapping him in a lonely, isolated existence at the apex of power. He could see the plots against him, the betrayals that were coming, but he often had to allow them to unfold to avoid diverting the future onto an even darker course. Perhaps the most profound limit was that prescience could not change human nature. Paul could see the currents of history, but he could not command the tides of human greed, ambition, and fear. He could impose a new order, but he could not create a new kind of human being. His subjects, even his most fanatical Fremen followers, were still driven by their own desires and weaknesses. His empire, for all its centralized power, was still a human institution, with all the flaws and contradictions that entailed. In the end, Paul's reign was a tragedy. He had achieved absolute power, but it had brought him no peace. He had saved humanity from extinction, but at a cost that haunted him forever. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale about the pursuit of perfect knowledge and perfect control. It demonstrates that even for a ruler who can see through time, governance is not a science. It is a constant, messy, and often brutal struggle with the intractable realities of the universe and the imperfect nature of humanity itself. Part V. Long Shadows. Chapter 24. Leto II and the Golden Path. After Paul Muad'Dib walked into the desert, a blind exile, the Imperium was left in the hands of his sister, Alia, acting as regent for his twin children, Leto II and Ghanima. But the forces Paul had unleashed, the Jihad, the fanatical Qizarate priesthood, and the deep-seated conspiracies of the old powers threatened to tear his empire apart. It fell to his son, Leto II, to confront the terrible choice that his father had shied away from. Leto saw, with an even greater clarity of prescience, the ultimate trap that lay in humanity's future: extinction. To save the species, he embarked upon a course of action so extreme and so monstrous that it would dwarf even his father's bloody jihad. This was the Golden Path. The Golden Path was Leto's solution to the problem that had plagued his father. He saw that humanity, under the rule of a prescient emperor, had become dependent and stagnant. The ability to see the future created a stable, predictable society, but it also stifled creativity, rebellion, and the very chaos that drove evolution and survival. Humanity was trapped in the comforting embrace of the Oracle, and if it remained there, it would eventually be hunted down and destroyed by some unforeseen predator or crisis. The only way to ensure long-term survival was to utterly destroy this dependency, to teach humanity a lesson in survival so harsh that it would be burned into their collective genetic memory. To achieve this, Leto needed to seize absolute control over every aspect of human life. He needed a monopoly not just of force and religion, but of time itself. He began this process by undertaking a radical physical transformation. He allowed the sand trout, the larval form of the sandworms, to attach themselves to his body. Over time, these sand trout formed a living, symbiotic skin, granting him immense strength, speed, and near invulnerability. This transformation, which would eventually turn him into a grotesque human sandworm hybrid, also gave him a lifespan of thousands of years. He became a god in the flesh, a being who could outlive any opposition. With his physical and prescient powers consolidated, Leto II, the god emperor, seized the throne and began his long reign of systematic oppression. He dismantled the old power structures completely. The Landsraad was formally disbanded, its great houses stripped of all but their ceremonial titles. C.H.O.A.M was absorbed entirely into his personal administration, its function reduced to simple resource management under his direct command. He held a total monopoly on the spice melange, which he used to control the Spacing Guild and the Bene Gesserit, doling out just enough to keep them dependent, but not enough to make them a threat. His control over the planet Dune was absolute. He destroyed all the sandworms except for himself, making him the sole source of the spice cycle. He began a slow, deliberate ecological transformation of Dune, using his control of the weather to turn the desert planet into a lush, green world. This act, while seeming benevolent, was a profound act of control. It destroyed the old Fremen culture, which was based on the harsh realities of the desert, and turned them into a tame, dependent population, museum pieces of their former, fierce selves. Leto II's reign, which would last for 3,500 years, was a carefully engineered dark age. He deliberately froze human society, enforcing a rigid peace, the peace of Leto, that suppressed all dissent, all ambition, and all significant technological innovation. He ruled as an absolute tyrant, using his all-female army, the Fish Speakers, to enforce his will across the galaxy. His goal was to create a pressure cooker, to build up a desperate, explosive need for freedom and expansion in the human spirit. The Golden Path was a terrible, millennia-long lesson in the horrors of stability, designed to ensure that when it was over, humanity would scatter to the far corners of the universe, forever beyond the reach of any single ruler or prescient oracle. Chapter 25. The Tyrant's Political Technology. The 3,500-year reign of Leto II, the God Emperor, was the longest and most stable period of rule in human history. This stability was not achieved through consensus or benevolence, but through the application of a sophisticated and ruthless political technology. Leto did not simply rule as a tyrant. He re-engineered the very infrastructure of the Imperium to create a system of absolute, centralized control. His methods were a dark reflection of the old power triangle, twisting its components into a new monolithic structure. The foundation of his power was his absolute monopoly on the spice. By destroying the sandworms and becoming the sole nexus of the spice cycle himself, he transformed the galactic economy. The spice was no longer a commodity to be mined and traded. It was a sacrament to be dispensed by the God Emperor himself. He controlled the Spacing Guild by carefully rationing their spice supply, keeping them on the brink of withdrawal, ensuring their complete obedience. The Bene Gesserit, who also needed the spice for their rituals, were similarly held in check. He had taken the economic lever of CHOAM and made it an extension of his own biological existence. His military power was embodied in the Fish Speakers. This all-female army was fanatically loyal to him, bound by a religious awe that surpassed even the Fremen's devotion to his father. He recruited them from across the Imperium, taking them from their home worlds and indoctrinating them in his service on Dune. The Fish Speakers were not just an army. They were his administrators, his missionaries, and his secret police. They replaced the old nobility as the ruling class. Their authority derived directly from their god. This created a new power structure, one with no competing loyalties or independent power bases. Leto also mastered the art of controlled scarcity and famine management. He used his prescient knowledge to foresee ecological disasters and resource shortages on various planets. However, instead of always preventing them, he would sometimes allow them to happen, only to swoop in at the last moment with relief supplies from his central storehouses on Dune. This created a powerful cycle of dependency. The worlds of the Imperium came to see the God Emperor not just as a ruler, but as the sole guarantor of their survival. Their loyalty was purchased with the fear of starvation and the promise of salvation, both of which he controlled. The infrastructure of the Imperium was rebuilt around his capital on Dune, which he had transformed into a lush, temperate paradise. The planet became the administrative, religious, and economic center of the universe in a way that C.H.O.A.M never was. All significant trade and communication flowed through the systems he controlled. He deliberately kept the technologies of the wider Imperium in a state of relative stagnation, preventing the development of any new weapons or travel methods that could challenge his rule or the guild's monopoly. His reign was a great peace, but it was the peace of a well-managed prison. This entire political technology was designed to serve the Golden Path. Every act of control, every suppression of freedom, was a calculated part of his grand strategy to force humanity into a new stage of its evolution. He was the ultimate centralizing force, the bottleneck through which all of human history had to pass. He knew that his tyranny was creating a deep, pent-up desire for chaos and expansion. He was meticulously building the bomb that he knew would one day be used against him, scattering the fragments of humanity so far that no single power could ever gather them up again. Chapter 26. After the Tyrant. The death of Leto II was as transformative as his long life. He was assassinated, as he had long foreseen and planned, by Siona Atreides, a distant descendant of his own line, with the help of a new Duncan Idaho Gola. His death caused his sandworm body to disintegrate, and the sand trout that made up his skin were released back into the environment of Dune. With water now abundant on the planet, the sand trout began to multiply, starting the sandworm life cycle anew. The spice would return to the universe, but it would take centuries. His death simultaneously ended his tyranny and planted the seeds for the restoration of the old galactic economy. The immediate aftermath of the tyrant's death was chaos. The Imperium, which had been held in a state of enforced peace for 3.5 millennia, exploded. The central authority of the God Emperor vanished overnight. The fish-speaker army, deprived of their god, fractured into competing factions. The worlds of the Imperium, suddenly freed from Leto's oppressive control, descended into a period of widespread warfare and political turmoil known as the Famine Times. With the central storehouses of Dune no longer distributing resources, many worlds faced starvation. The peace of Leto was replaced by the chaos of freedom. But this chaos was the intended outcome of the Golden Path. Humanity, which had been confined and suppressed for so long, now possessed a ferocious, explosive drive to expand. This period of turmoil culminated in the Scattering, a new diaspora that dwarfed the original expansion from old Earth. Billions of people, desperate to escape the famine, the wars, and the memory of the tyrant, fled the old Imperium. They used the newly available, though still scarce, spice to fuel their journeys into the unknown, uncharted regions of space. This was the ultimate success of the Golden Path. The Scattering sent humanity in countless directions, ensuring that the species could never again be cornered by a single threat or controlled by a single prescient ruler. Leto had given humanity a lesson in the dangers of predictability, and the survivors had learned it well. They fled into the void, seeking not just new worlds to colonize, but new futures, free from the guiding hand of any oracle. In the wake of the Scattering, new power markets began to emerge. The old Imperium, the collection of worlds centered on Dune, was now just one of many human societies. The Spacing Guild lost its absolute monopoly on travel, as new, non-prescient methods of navigation were developed. The Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, having survived the tyrant's reign through careful planning, re-emerged as a major power, working to guide humanity from the shadows. The old institutions were gone, but the needs they had fulfilled remained. New forms of interstellar trade required new economic arrangements, creating successors to C.H.O.A.M. The need for political negotiation and collective security among the newly settled worlds led to the formation of new councils and confederations. Echoes of the Landsraad, the dream of a unified empire, though shattered by the tyrant and the Scattering, did not die completely. The long shadow of Leto II had created a new, more resilient and diverse human universe, but one in which the old patterns of power, wealth, and conflict would inevitably begin to reappear in new and unfamiliar forms. Chapter 27. Successor Orders. In the millennia that followed the Scattering, the human universe was fundamentally and permanently changed. The old, centralized Imperium was a distant memory, a myth from a fallen age. Humanity was now spread across countless galaxies, its various branches evolving in isolation, developing new technologies, new cultures, and new forms of social organization. The return of some of these lost ones to the worlds of the old Imperium created new conflicts and new syntheses of power. In this fractured and dynamic environment, the old power triangle of Emperor, Landsraad, and C.H.O.A.M did not reappear in its exact form, but its functions were reinvented by new successor orders. The most powerful of these new orders were the honored Matres, a violent, matriarchal society that returned from the Scattering with overwhelming force. They were a dark mirror of the Bene Gesserit, using sexual enslavement and raw, destructive power to conquer and control entire systems. They represented a new form of absolute, coercive rule, a tyranny without the long-term vision of Leto II's Golden Path. Their arrival shattered the fragile peace of the old Imperium and forced the other powers to adapt or be destroyed. The Bene Gesserit Sisterhood became the primary force of stability and long-term planning in this chaotic era. They were the inheritors of Leto's vision, working to guide humanity subtly, without the overt control of a prescient oracle. They manipulated politics, religion, and economics from behind the scenes, their goal being the survival and continued evolution of the human species. They effectively took on the role that the Corrino emperors had once played, acting as the balancing wheel of the known universe, albeit through manipulation rather than direct military force. The Spacing Guild, its monopoly broken, was forced to compete with other forms of interstellar travel and trade. The economic functions once monopolized by CHOAM were now distributed among a variety of organizations. The Bene Gesserit, with their mastery of genetic engineering and their ability to produce artificial spice, became a major economic power. New mercantile combines arose, creating complex trade networks between the worlds of the old Imperium and the returning factions from the scattering. The economy was no longer a single monolithic entity, but a complex, decentralized market of competing interests. The concept of a universal council, like the Landsraad, was impossible in a universe where the distances were too vast and the cultures too different. Instead, power was organized into regional alliances and spheres of influence. The Bene Gesserit might control one sector, the honored Matres another, and a powerful planetary confederation a third. Law and custom were no longer universal, but local. The old, predictable rules of Canley and the Great Convention were gone, replaced by a more fluid and dangerous political landscape, where betrayal was common and total war was a constant threat. The defining feature of this new era was the breaking of prediction. The Golden Path had succeeded in creating a humanity that was too vast, too complex, and too chaotic to be seen by a single prescient eye. Siona Atreides' descendants, who carried a genetic trait that made them invisible to prescience, were now scattered throughout the universe. This meant that no single leader could ever again use foresight to trap humanity in a predictable future. The uncertainty that Leto II had so carefully cultivated had become the permanent condition of the human race. Councils, shares, and thrones still existed, but their power was now limited, conditional, and forever challenged by the unknown. Chapter 28. Echoes and Recurrences. The grand narrative of the Dune universe, from the Butlerian Jihad to the aftermath of the scattering, is a story of cycles. It is a history marked by the rise and fall of institutions that, while different in name and form, often serve the same fundamental purposes. The power triangle of Emperor, Landsraad, and C.H.O.A.M was not a static, eternal structure, but one expression of a recurring pattern in the organization of human power. The history of the Imperium is a testament to the idea that while empires may crumble and gods may die, the underlying dynamics of politics and economics endure. The function of the emperor, the centralizing executive authority, is a constant. This role was first filled by the Corrino dynasty, who used the myth of their founding and the terror of their Sardaukar to hold the system together. It was then seized by Paul Atreides, who transformed it into a position of absolute religious and economic power. Leto II took this to its logical extreme, becoming a literal god-king whose control was total. After his death, the honored Matres attempted to impose their own form of centralized, coercive rule. In every era, the need for a final arbiter, a symbol of unity, and a wielder of ultimate force reasserts itself, even if the nature of that force changes from legions to faith to biological monstrosity. Similarly, the function of the Landsraad, the council of the powerful who check the central authority and regulate their own competition, constantly reappears. The original Landsraad of the Great Houses was a formal, legalistic body. Under Paul, it became a court of supplicants. Under Leto II, it vanished entirely. But after the scattering, its role was reborn in the form of new alliances and confederations. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood itself began to act as a kind of shadow, Landsraad, mediating between factions and working to maintain a balance of power. The fundamental tension between the central authority and the collective power of the elite is a permanent feature of the political landscape. The economic engine, personified by CHOAM, also shows this pattern of recurrence. CHOAM was the first great attempt to unify the galactic economy and use profit as a tool of political control. Paul and Leto turned it into a state-run monopoly. After the scattering, its functions were taken over by a decentralized market of competing entities like the Bene Gesserit and new mercantile guilds. Yet, the underlying principle remains the same. Control of essential resources and trade routes translates directly into political power. Whether the key commodity is spice, water, or advanced technology, the power to control its distribution is the power to shape society. The history of these institutions teaches a crucial lesson about power. It is not static, it is fluid and adaptive. It is a constant negotiation between the forces of centralization and decentralization, of monopoly and competition, of law and violence. The specific forms of the institutions, the names of the councils, the titles of the rulers, the charters of the companies, are temporary. But the functions they serve, the human needs for order, for wealth, and for a forum to manage conflict, are eternal. The triangle of power, in one form or another, keeps reappearing because it is a natural structure for managing the complexities of a vast interstellar civilization. The deserts of Arrakis taught the first Imperium its limits, and the infinite void of the scattering taught its successors that the game of power, though its rules may change, never truly ends. Epilogue. The story of the Imperium's great institutions is, in the final analysis, a story about humanity's relationship with control. It is a chronicle of the ceaseless effort to manage the unpredictable forces of history, economics, and human nature itself. The great power triangle formed by the imperial house, the Landsraad, and CHOAM was the most enduring and sophisticated attempt to achieve this control. It was a machine designed to convert the chaos of feudal ambition into a stable, predictable, and profitable order. For 10,000 years, this machine worked. It created a long peace, fostered interstellar commerce, and sustained a galactic civilization on an unprecedented scale. The machine was built on a series of carefully balanced bargains. The emperor offered legitimacy and ultimate security in exchange for supreme authority. The Landsraad surrendered the right to unlimited warfare in exchange for collective security and the preservation of their aristocratic privileges. CHOAM bound them all together, converting their political rivalries into economic competition, making stability more profitable than open conflict. This system was lubricated by the spice melange, the one resource that made it all possible, and policed by external forces like the Spacing Guild and the Bene Gesserit, who enforced their own bargains upon the structure. This intricate system of checks and balances was a monumental achievement of social engineering. It used law, ritual, and custom to channel the most dangerous human instincts into manageable forms. Canley replaced total war with targeted assassination. Corporate maneuvering replaced armed rebellion. The public theater of the imperial court and the Landsraad High Council masked a constant, ruthless, but largely bloodless struggle for power. The system's greatest strength was its ability to convert uncertainty into predictable commodities, profit, legal standing, and ritualized honor. But the lesson of Dune is that every system, no matter how perfectly designed, contains the seeds of its own destruction. The Imperium's fatal flaw was its reliance on a single point of failure, the planet Arrakis. The entire magnificent structure, with its 10 millennia of tradition and law, rested on a fragile ecological foundation that its rulers never bothered to understand. They saw Arrakis as a resource to be exploited, not as a complex system with its own power and its own people. They built their palace on the back of a sleeping giant, and when that giant, the ecological power of the sandworms and the human power of the Fremen, finally awoke, the entire edifice came crashing down. Paul Atreides and his son Leto II did not just conquer the old Imperium. They broke its fundamental premise. They demonstrated that true power did not come from balancing the system, but from controlling its source. Paul seized control of the spice, and in doing so, seized control of the future. Leto took this a step further, becoming the source himself, and in his tyranny, he taught humanity the ultimate lesson about control. He showed them that perfect stability, perfect predictability, was a form of death. His golden path was a controlled demolition of the very idea of a controllable universe, designed to create a humanity so widespread and chaotic that it could never again be trapped by a single system, a single resource, or a single vision. The echoes of the old triangle endure, not as institutions, but as ideas. The need for a central power to provide order, the need for a council to check that power, and the need for an economic system to fuel it, all these are constants. But the final lesson is one of humility. It is the recognition that all power is conditional, all control is temporary, and that the universe is always larger and more complex than the systems we build to contain it. Empires survive on prices and promises, but they are ultimately judged by their ability to adapt to new ecologies. The old Imperium failed this test. It learned, too late, that the most powerful force in the universe is not a throne, a council, or a corporation, but the inexorable and unpredictable process of change itself.